Today we will talk about communication theory and its application to the understanding of the processes of communication. Communication remains the most fundamental of human activities, and it is also one of the most complex activities human beings are engaged in on a day-to-day basis. So in order to understand communication, we have to devise certain methods and methodologies to reveal the intricacies and the complexities which lie within the process of communication. So in order to do that, we have to evolve theories and models of theories for research and understanding of communication. Communication as an academic discipline exists only since 1920s. Before that, you would see the main liberal arts subjects in social sciences, medicine, law, architecture, engineering, and other older academic disciplines existed. They already had some theoretical models in each subject to understand the discipline. Since communication is hardly less than a century old, we were slow in evolving processes and models which could shed light on the communication process or communication activity as such. So we begin in the 1920s. The scene is the United States of America. What is happening in the 1920s is the First World War, which is breaking out in Europe, and the United States is about to be actively engaged in that war, primarily the war between the states in Western Europe. It became quite obvious that the new technologies of radio and cinema, film that is, by mid-20s, were applied to the activity of war in the battlefield, like the radio sets being used between the commanding post and the soldiers on the battlefront. And the cinema halls were being packed with films on propaganda, basically propaganda films advancing certain political doctrine which would help you understand and take sides with the World War I. The end of the World War signaled a need for the understanding of communication. So in some of the universities in the United States of America, the quest for understanding of human communication came about, or pursued quite rather, let's say, more rigorously, and mainly because to understand the effects of communication, like for example propaganda. Does propaganda, which is done in a political ideology or in the context of advancing a political doctrine, is that effective or is that not effective? You needed to see the results of certain communication strategies. So you begin to see the early theories of communication being developed. And early theories were simply done in the idea of the fact that human beings are quite passive. Whatever information you inject into humans, they would be digested, and then you would have certain action by the human body or the human group, whatever that is. So it came to be known as very simplistic terms like the magic bullet theory or hypodermic needle theories. In other words, you inject a piece of information into a human body, it will be assimilated, it will be contextualized, and then finally some human action takes place. Now we all know now that they were very, very simplistic in their outlook on what communication is. It also undermined the human engagement in the communication process. I think human beings were pretty much treated like they were passive, like dogs, cats, where you whistle or you snap a finger and there is a reaction from the animal. Human beings were also viewed like that, mainly because it was seen in the military context of a war strategy. After 1920s and 1930s, I think the real sophistication of evolving communication theories began in the 1940s and later on in the 1950s. Why? Because for one thing, there was a need to understand communication, like I mentioned, but also there was a need to legitimize the discipline of communication study. That communication was not a particularly academic discipline until then, and there was a quest so that you could actually make communication a viably intellectual or a viably strong academic discipline in a university setting. So you have that need for theory with a selfish motive of legitimizing an academic discipline, but also the need for theory to make human beings understand how communication works, because we take communication for granted. We think it is a very simple process of saying something and being understood by the other person. But we know now that a lot of technologies have been evolved, a lot of human interaction has failed, which resulted in many bloodshed, wars, and brutal genocides around the world. So we know that communication can break down easily. So you understood now for the first time why a theoretical understanding of communication was very, very important. So why do we need a theory, a communication theory? And what is theory? So we'll talk about that in the next few minutes. A theory makes us, number one, understand what communication is all about. Because we know communication is a very complex process. It has many, many factors, many, many strategies, many, many layers. So in order to make sense out of this complex phenomenon, we need to evolve a common body of knowledge or a set of principles which are called theory. Number two, theory also makes us use communication in a more effective manner. Why is that necessary? In a developing country, a clever and very effective use of communication is as important strategically as any other human activity in that society. So the importance of theory can be described in two ways. One, we need to understand the phenomenon of communication. Number two, because we understand it better, we can use communication more effectively. Those are the two factors. Theory cannot be explained only in complex expositions in a long discourse on what all these important principles and factors are in theory. They can be explained through models of communication. Now, we all know that communication has a clear intent. All communication activity has some form of intent behind that. That's why it's called the idea that all communication all communication strives for something common between people. The evolution of the word common into commune, into community, and finally into communication. See how closely all these words and terms are linked, mainly because communication strives to establish some common ground among people. Now, so in order to study communication, then you have to derive and establish certain theoretical models. One of the first models we see is the one which is popularly known as the Shannon-Weaver theoretical model. Now, that Shannon-Weaver theory was also termed the mathematical theory of communication or the information theory of communication. Different terms are used for the understanding of this particular theory. Now, if you put the communication discipline in an academic context, you know why both Shannon and Weaver come from an electrical engineering background, because both of them were scientists, both of them were trying to work for telephone labs in the United States, and their understanding of how point-to-point communication works, where the source originates of certain messages, how it ends up at a certain receiving point, and all the complex modeling through which these processes go through from that point to point communication. Shannon and Weaver got quite excited about the idea of understanding communication through this particular model. Now, if you look at communication theory itself, historically, you can see two schools of thought dominating the theoretical models. One is called the social scientific idea or perspective, and the other one is called the historical cultural perspective. Social scientific, cultural historical. One, which is the social and scientific model, is quantitative in nature. In other words, it is statistically oriented. It needs to establish certain data. It needs to collect certain data so that it can actually refute or accept certain fundamental findings of certain research projects in communication. The historical and cultural perspective is much more broader in nature. It is more qualitative in nature, in the sense that quantitative studies against or versus the qualitative studies. So we are now talking about the quantified or the quantitative theories in communication. So when you talk about Shannon Weaver coming out of the engineering background, naturally they want to apply theories in mathematics into understanding of communication. So Shannon Weaver established this model called the mathematical theory, which has two major goals. One is to not only understand communication in an electronic technical medium, but also to maximize the efficiency through which communication can be implemented, strategies or goal-oriented communication, or the user-oriented communication technologies, consumer and the consumption of electronics, all have to be marketed and advanced. So you need to understand how communication flows through those techniques and technologies of communication. So maximizing information efficiency was one of the Shannon Weaver theoretical model's goals. The second one was to establish our understanding of how channels of communication work, because before that we understood communication mostly in an oral format, in the sense that human to human communication, oral communication, use of language, etc., etc. But to bring in complex technologies into the communication process in between human beings, we need to look at how channel capacities work, whether channel can actually inhibit messages or do they actually promote clarity in messages being communicated from point to point. In that sense, Shannon and Weaver evolved a certain set of principles as a background, as a framework through which communication can be studied. So that's one of the first theories which we call the Shannon-Weaver model, mathematical model, or the information model. The second theory is called information or communication studied in the context of systems theory. Now the systems theory takes into consideration a little bit broader agenda, whereby you apply your understanding of a social system, for example, or some kind of a natural system which is already existing in many societies and communities, and you study communication through a systems perspective. That is, communication is an all-encompassing human activity. It pervades all human endeavors, and so you need to take into consideration social systems, the natural systems, and how communication actually flows, how information flows between these systems from top down, bottom up, lateral, vertical, horizontal flows of communication have to be understood, and that's called the systems model as such. Now, most of the ideas or the principles in systems theory takes into consideration that there are interactive parts to communication processes. Okay? There is a lot of action and interaction. There's lots of interactive nature to communication processes, and that can be applied or seen through a systemic idea of what communication is. The other imperative or the other requirement of systems theory in communication is the use of, again, statistical data to understand how communication and information flows. And that all is designed to make communication more effective or be more efficient as such. The other popular or quite a major school of theory in communication is called the diffusion theory. In other words, how information can be diffused both at a mass level and a small group level. Now, this is very important for the context of the developing societies, how information on health care, population control, family planning, HIV, AIDS virus, etc., can be disseminated to the public at large so that they can take steps to eradicate certain health issues and problems in the society. So the diffusion theory implies that there are innovations to be introduced into the society, and that is called the diffusion of innovations through communication strategies. So you put diffusion's idea into a theoretical principle and evolve another communication theory called the diffusion of innovations. Why is that very effective in the developing societies context? Because I think there are lots of sub-theories within diffusion of innovation theories, like the endemic theory, the epidemic theory or the economic theory. The epidemic theory takes into consideration that there is an outbreak of cholera or malaria or polio, whatever, and how do you involve the citizenry, how do you involve the community people into understanding the drastic consequences of these diseases. So there is a diffusion of innovation involved in this process of communication. The other notable theory we have been studying for about 40 to 50 years now, half a century, is called two-step flow theory. Two-step flow theory implies that communication travels through steps, certain steps. For example, a source giving messages out first reach certain opinion leaders in a village. That is the first step. And in turn, the opinion leaders of that village will call in their own community and village people together for a meeting, and then they discuss the idea of whatever being disseminated. So that there are two steps involved in it: source to opinion leaders, and then opinion leaders to the villagers as such. So that is the two-step flow of theory: source to opinion leaders to the masses as such. And that is called the two-step flow theory. Now, the other theories which we talk about, one of the most impressive ones which I consider is phenomenal in any context, is the semantic theory. The semantic theory again quantifies information, because we are looking at the social scientific perspectives of communication theory. Semantic theory quantifies information which is already existent or which is being sought in terms of data, opinion polls, etc., gathering them, and it makes certain distinctions, that certain two distinctive sets of communities or elements or languages or symbols exist naturally in any society or in any community. And the interaction between these two sets of symbols or these two sets of languages or these two sets of people or different types of elements, the semantic theory implies that we first have to assume that human beings are diverse, naturally diverse, with diverse interests, conflicting tastes, and sometimes tension between the groups as such. So it takes into consideration the natural chaos of humanity, and then it assumes that there are certain coding mechanisms which take place between these two elements or between these two language or linguistic groups. Coding and decoding becomes an absolutely essential part of the communication theory. You have the coding mechanism. In other words, how do you evolve messages? The process of evolving messages is called the coding mechanism. You encode a message which then has to be decoded by your audiences. So the encoding takes place at the source level, the decoding takes place at the receiver level. So the semantic theory strives to understand how this coding mechanism works, whether it works smoothly, whether it works with tension in between. How do you sort out all these elements of friction within communication processes? So the importance of encoding, decoding, interpreting these codes are the natural factors or principles which lie within the semantic theory as such. Now, let's move on to the other theory called the general communication system model, or the general communication theory as such, where you have clearly identifiable particles or parts to the communication process. Okay? You have the source, you have the transmitter, transmitting technology, that is, the message itself which comes out of a coding mechanism, the channel in which the message flows through, how it goes to the receiver, and how it ends up in a desired destination. All these separate but sometimes conflicting parts are the main focus of the general communication system model as such, or the theory as such. What the general communication system theory considers important is to understand that in the communication process there are naturally certain noises built into that system or built into that process of communication. When there is a noise, there is a chance to misunderstand the communication which has taken place, or the message which is being evolved and accepted and received by the audiences. So if you look at the noises involved in the communication process, you can describe these noises through this communication theoretical model. One is the channel noise itself. The channel carries certain inbuilt noises. For example, radio broadcasts can have static, where the reception of the signals by your transmitter radio could be disruptive, and that is the communication channel noise as such. There is another noise called the semantic noise, where you simply don't understand the message which is coming to you. That could be in a different language, that could be in your own language, but has not been designed in such a way that there is a clear understanding of the message involved. Sometimes the semantic noise makes clarity of communication impossible. There are other noises which we can look at. The lack of a feedback mechanism, which is one of the failures or one of the weak points in social scientific theories of communication, is the neglect of the feedback mechanism, and that itself can be a noise in the understanding of what communication is all about. The other major noise in any communication process is the frames of reference, or the cultural aspects of how communication can create misunderstanding instead of understanding. And this understanding, and you have to have an understanding of what these noises are. Noises in the sense, we are not just looking at in audio noises. They can be just descriptively different sorts of noises which we have to keep in mind as future communicators of India. You have to understand how these noises can interrupt and interfere with clarity of communication. Now, within this theory itself, you look at how the channels, the media, communicate messages, and how you can first differentiate the different types of media in order to understand how communication flows in this general communication systems theory as such. So far we have been talking communication theory in the school of social scientific perspective as such. Now let's talk a little bit about communication theory as seen from a cultural historical perspective, or historical cultural perspective. Either you can refer to both as such. Now the cultural historical perspective is qualitative in nature, in the sense that it does not necessarily accept the mathematical idea or the statistical idea to understand communication, because statistics or data which we gather can be misleading and or can be inadequate. They don't reject the communication theory from of a quantitative nature completely, but they think that it is limited. It can be very highly effective in public opinion polling, or in voting research, how people vote, how they understand political messages. All these communication theories are very highly applicable to the understanding of how communication works from a social scientific perspective. But the historical cultural perspective takes a broader idea of what community or what a society is. Essentially, they don't start with communication, okay, this particular perspective. They start from the society or the community itself. So you need to have a broader base of knowledge in sociology, psychology, political science, economics, history, literature, languages, etc., etc. So that is much more challenging or much more complex, you can call that. But there are certain theories or certain models which have evolved in the historical and cultural perspective too. One of the first ones is called the literary theory, how literary theory attempts to understand what communication is. Now, if you look at the idea of books, the written word, communication through newspapers, magazines, and other written sources, it becomes very much of a fertile ground for literary theory to be applied to that. There are certain fundamental premises or principles of texts and the textuality or the textual nature of communication tools which the literary theory tries to understand. The other theory is called the postmodernist or the modernist theory, in the sense that postmodernist theory is much more applicable to urban settings, major cities, where human beings keep on constantly evolving methods of communication to make their lives easy because their lives are becoming more complex. So in a way, postmodernist theories which evolved from France, Great Britain, Germany, and partly United States, try to understand human beings in a very complex, crowded city, urban development kind of a setting, a chaotic setting, trying to make sense out of their lives through different models of communication. So in my particular opinion, I would say that each theory gives us something which can be applied universally or which can be applied to different cultural settings universally. And I would say that each theory, when it gives you those strings of meaningfulness, we can cohesively bring all theories, what is applicable in those theories to Indian settings, put it in a cohesive body of knowledge, and probably call it the Indian theory of communication or theories of Indian communication, or how theories can make our research and our understanding of communication in India possible and meaningful and can be explained clearly to everyone who is engaged in the act of communication.
మా కార్యక్రమాలపై మీ సూచనలు, సలహాలు, అభిప్రాయాలు మాకు తెలియజేయండి. మీ సూచనలు, సలహాలు, అభిప్రాయాలు మాకు తెలియజేయవలసిన చిరునామా: డైరెక్టర్, ఆడియో విజువల్ ప్రొడక్షన్ అండ్ రీసెర్చ్ సెంటర్, డాక్టర్ బిఆర్ అంబేద్కర్ ఓపెన్ యూనివర్సిటీ, ప్రొఫెసర్ జి రామరెడ్డి మార్గ్, రోడ్ నంబర్ 46, జూబ్లీ హిల్స్, హైదరాబాద్ 500033.